Get off my lawn. Good morning, and welcome to the Country Curmudgeon. As I have let you know in my intro, my purpose in doing these little videos is to talk about things that irritate me. I'm not here to just repeat what other people are talking about. I'm not here just to rehash things that other people find distasteful. I'm here to talk about my personal dislikes and pet peeves and so forth. If that makes me sound egotistical, that I think are impacting other people's lives as well. Now, this first subject that we're going to talk about today is one that is extremely personal to me, and I'm going to tell you a few stories about my past life that will explain to you why. I am not an expert on the subject. I am not a scholar. I am not a influencer. But this particular subject has impacted my life on several occasions. And it's been somewhat traumatic, quite eye-opening, and it has formed who I am to this day. That is the subject of the bloodthirsty Mormon belief that killing someone when it is sanctioned by God Himself is the thing to do. And specifically, we're going to talk about the Book of Mormon and the story of Nephi killing Laban. Why are we going to talk about that specifically? Well, because that story, being at the beginning of the Book of Mormon, has influenced people throughout the Mormon Church in a way that is so much bigger than almost anything else. Yes, the Mormons had, through Brigham Young's teachings of the blood atonement, they had quite a bloodthirsty background there. There's all the other information about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, the Danites, so forth and so on. But the interesting thing about the story of Nephi killing Laban in the Book of Mormon is that it's within the first few chapters of the Book of Mormon itself. And having grown up as a young Mormon boy, being told constantly that I need to read the Book of Mormon, read the Book of Mormon, read the Book of Mormon. Raise your hands if you were like me. You would start to read the Book of Mormon and get about 3 or 4 chapters in, and then you would give it up for a while. Then you would come along and repent and start reading the Book of Mormon again. And of course, you'd get through the first 3 or 4 chapters or 10 chapters, and you'd peter out. Basically, that means that every time I tried to be a good Mormon boy and read the Book of Mormon, the first thing that hit me in the face every single time was the story of Nephi killing Laban at God's command. Now, my point here is that is almost indoctrination by default. Nobody Nobody took it and said, hey, you got to read this story about Nephi killing Laban because it needs to teach you that you can kill people if God tells you to. But it kind of indoctrinated me. It was center to my young growing up attitudes, because every time I decided to start reading the Book of Mormon, the first impactful story that came to me was Nephi killed Laban because God told him to. And I'm going to explain, again, like I said, several events in my life that really impacted me in terms of how bloodthirsty that story is, and the bloodthirsty events that over the past 200 years or so, that story has inspired. The ones that I personally have experienced. You'll have plenty of opportunity, if you choose to find other things that indicate how horrible that particular passage in the Book of Mormon has influenced the Mormon culture throughout the years. But these are ones that I saw personally. Now, first of all, we're going to talk about the Mormon Church's actual published attitude about this. We're not going to read through those passages in the Book of Mormon because, frankly, I don't allow a single copy of that book in my house anymore. It's a bloodthirsty book, starting with Nephi and Laban, going through the guy chopping people's arms off and stoning people to death, and thousands and millions of people dying at the end, and so forth and so on. And it's just horrific. So I don't allow the book in my house. But as you probably know, or maybe you don't know, the Mormon Church itself has put quite a few, I guess what they would call what they do call essays online. We call them apologetics. But there's quite a few of those kinds of things online nowadays on the church's own website. And there's an article by a guy named Clyde J. Williams on the church's website. It's called The Power of Deliverance, Why Nephi Killed Laban. And the subtitle under Clyde J. Williams' name is Correlation Department. And some people call it correlation, other people call it propaganda. In either case, it's very, very authoritarian. It's very, very totalitarian. And the church themselves run this correlation department so that nobody speaks out of turn and everybody has to teach the same thing. Of course, it has to be what the church sanctions. The sub-headline to this article is, quote, "What appears to be the breaking of a commandment is actually an example of God's great mercy." And it goes through a lot of, first of all, the area that we're talking about is First Nephi, and it's generally chapters 3 through 4, and a little bit of Second Nephi, stuff like that. Nephi chose to include the story it talks about. And it talks about the fact that Nephi compiled the plates that were to be passed down through his family history. And this guy thinks that it's a neat thing that Nephi chose to put in the story of him murdering this drunk man, Laban, so that he could have his family treasures that Laban wouldn't give them. Yeah, the story goes through Laban throwing them out under threat of their life, or just, promising to be mean to them. And somehow that justifies Nephi coming back and killing Laban. Nephi says, "But behold, I, Nephi, will show unto you that the tender mercies of the Lord are over all those whom he hath chosen because of their faith, to make them mighty, even unto the power of deliverance." And my question is, who delivered Laban from Nephi's murderous scheme? Nobody. This author talks about the context of what is happening here being crucial. And he says that the lot fell to Laman, Nephi's older brother, to go in and try to convince Laban to give them these brass plates that were the history of all of the house of Israel, specifically Lehi, Nephi's father's family history. Makes you kind of wonder what modern day Mormons would do if somebody had a bunch of their family genealogy and they wouldn't give them to them. We'll kind of think about that in a while. Anyway, they went in and Laban threw them out. So they go in a second time and Laban throws them out again, and he threatens to kill them and stuff like that. So Nephi says, well, I'll go in by myself. Nephi was a very egotistical man. He was always saying, because my brothers are wicked and I'm righteous, I'm going to go do the thing that the Lord told me to do, and neener. So he goes in, and it says, as Nephi Nephi comes upon Laban, and Laban is just passed out drunk. He's faced like you wouldn't believe. So Nephi finds Laban on the ground in a drunken stupor, and Nephi is thinking, what can I do to take advantage of this situation? And then it says that the Spirit constrained him to slay Laban. Imagine that. The guy's sitting there, drunk, laying there, drunk on the ground. But he's been mean to Laban and Lemuel. And so God, through the Spirit, tells Nephi. Now, the Spirit, or is that just Nephi thinking, I could actually just kill this guy and we'd be done with it? So the idea was abhorrent to Nephi, and he resisted. The Spirit prompted him twice more. Evidently, you got to do things 3 times in the Mormon Church. The Lord slayeth the wicked to bring forth his righteous purposes, this Spirit tells Nephi. While Nephi's reluctance reflected his respect for life, this experience ultimately demonstrated his deep reverence for obeying the will of the Lord. Now, remember that when we start talking about some of the modern day Nephis, you'll want to remember that. So now this part of the author's article is the crux of the matter as far as my growing up was concerned. This is maybe the most quoted evil justification and faith-promoting horror that is taught in the Mormon Church. Nephi recognized the record would help preserve his people's language and that his posterity would need to know the commandments in order to keep them. Without the brass plates, they would not have the prophet's words. Nephi also knew by the Spirit that the Lord had delivered Laban into his hands, and that it was better that one man should perish than that a nation should dwindle and perish in unbelief. Let me repeat that, because it's been repeated to me as a young man so many times I can't count. It was better that one man should perish than that a nation should dwindle and perish in unbelief. That is the justification here. That is taught to every young Mormon boy and every young Mormon girl. God told Nephi to kill Laban. It says that the Lord had delivered Laban into his hands. So I guess the Lord was one of these buddies that says, "Hey, Laban, have another one. You know, you haven't drunk enough. Let's get you really sauced here." And so the Lord delivered Laban into Nephi's hands by just plowing him with drinks. All right, so Nephi goes up and says, "Okay, well, since God told me to do it, I'm going to go do that." And he goes and kills Laban. Seriously, he just goes and kills Laban. Clyde J. Williams says then, Nephi recognized that the record would help preserve his people's language and that his posterity would need to know the commandments in order to keep them. Without the brass plates, they would not have the prophet's words. Okay, so that was really important. You got to have the prophet's word, and if people won't give you the prophet's words, you can kill them. The Lord was directing Nephi in a way that would result in the least loss of life. And as you read the rest of the Book of Mormon, you find out that hundreds of thousands and millions of people killed each other because of this schism that happens between Laman and Lemuel and Nephi and his younger brother Sam. Really? Sam? Anyway. So Nephi killing Laban and taking these records was going to result in the least loss of life. And I'd just like to know how many people would have been killed throughout the story of the Book of Mormon if Nephi didn't have those records. Leaving Laban alive would have likely led to more deaths and suffering. It's possible that he or others would have followed Nephi and his brothers into the wilderness and killed their entire family. So, Laban may have killed Lehi's family, so it's okay to kill Laban first. Okay. That's what this guy is saying as justifications for the teachings that are given to young Mormon youths. Nephi obeyed the Lord, he says. After slaying Laban, he dressed in Laban's clothing and armor and went toward the treasury where he met Zoram, yada, yada, yada. Okay, so there's been a few things said about this. Nephi chops Laban's head off and then puts on his bloody clothes. Well, Nephi takes those records, runs off and sees his brother. They think he's Laban. They don't notice the bloody clothes, and they don't notice that he doesn't look like Laban. People have really bad eyesight in the Book of Mormon if God wants them to. But Zoram, who became a critical second witness of this powerful deliverance, took courage from Nephi's words and swore his own oath that he would stay with them because he'd watched Nephi just kill a man. I guess you would stay with him because you're kind of on the hot seat for being an accessory to murder, aren't you, Zoram? Okay, so this is the justification. This is the article on the Mormon Church's website that talks about this is justification for killing a person. It all comes down to God said so. And who did God tell to do this? Well, the person that did the killing. That, again, is going to be extremely important when I talk to you about the modern day experiences that I have seen and witnessed and lived through. God tells only the person who he wants to do the killing that it's all right. The summary is, with this precise perspective of revelation, Nephi came to understand why he was required to obtain the plates in the way he did. When God delivered Laban and the brass plates to Nephi, he was ultimately delivering precious gospel truths to all who would eventually read the Book of Mormon. These truths are centered, yada, 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 Jesus Christ, yakety schmackety. So, it's justified. Now, this is the story that is taught to 6-year-olds, if not younger, in the Mormon Church. This is the story that is written into children's books and illustrated in children's books in the Mormon culture. This is the first significant, impactful story that every young Mormon reads every time he or she starts the Book of Mormon again. And as I said before, a lot of times they're starting the Book of Mormon, they're starting to read the Book of Mormon again in an act of repentance for not having been faithful enough to be reading it further than the first 3 or 4 chapters. So this is drummed into the head of, quite frankly, every young Mormon boy and girl. Now, let's see what that means for our modern world. Okay, this is where the story gets personal. Forgive me for giving a little bit of background on this first story, this first event. But I, of course, was born and raised in the Mormon Church in Mesa, Arizona, and fulfilled a mission for the church in Germany and in South Carolina. And when I came back, of course, the first thing that I wanted to do was leave home again and go up to Brigham Young University, the Mormon Church sponsored university in Provo, Utah, which I did in 1978. And I graduated in the summer of 1981. I originally wanted to get a degree in filmmaking, in movie making. Everything was Star Wars and Star Trek the Motion Picture, and I was very enamored with that kind of thing. And I wanted to get a degree in motion picture production. Through the course of my education, I decided I'll back off a little bit because I want to be the Mormon family man. I don't want to be traveling all over the world making movies. I want to be a television producer. And so that's the field of study that I went into at BYU. I was there from 1978 through 1981, and I participated very, very deeply in the BYU television production community. I didn't want to be on camera. I wanted to be the one that, put the thing together. And so I was a technical director and a producer. And, BYU had a really good television production I really liked all of the professors. I got to work as an engineer in the BYU remote production truck, which was responsible for airing all of the BYU football games. And of course, those were the years when BYU was really big in football. In fact, I think one of those years was the year that BYU was rated #1. And I was there when, was it Robbie Bosco became the #1 pick. I was also a producer and technical director of the TV station called KBYU, of their productions, not of the TV station itself, but of their productions. And so I was the technical director and producer on a little news hour that we produced every evening called Weeknight. And it would air on KBYU TV and so forth and so on. While I was there, I participated, as well as any other young red-blooded Mormon boy, in the pursuit of dating and or a wedded blissful life. So I dated a few people, a few gals that were in the department. And one of them I remember specifically was a gal named Brenda Wright. And when I say I dated, we didn't, it wasn't a big long thing. I might have gone on 3 or 4 dates with her. So in the late summer of 1979, I married a gal who I met at BYU, and we lived in the basement apartment of her grandparents in Orem, Utah. 1981 came along. My first baby was born in 1980. And 1981 came along. I graduated BYU. And the first thing I did was move down to Arizona and build a house there with the help of my father and cousins and uncles and brothers-in-laws and so forth and so on. Long story short, by 1982, we were back up in Utah because it was... in those days, it was like try to take a Utah girl out of Utah and they wither and die. And so by this time I had 2 children. We moved back up to Utah. And I took a job in television production, in news production. Shortly thereafter, started off into a totally different field. So eventually it was 1984, and we started hearing in the background of our lives, my wife and I, news reports about something that horrendous that had happened down in the Provo, Springville area. We were living in, we were living in South Provo at the time, and we started hearing about, we were living in Riverton at the time, and we started hearing these background news reports about something very, very horrific that had happened in southern Utah Valley. And it was about 2 fellas named Dan and Ron Lafferty. Dan and Ron Lafferty had a brother named Alan. And that's all background to what we started hearing about. But the news reports eventually came out and revealed that Dan and Ron Lafferty had gone uber Mormon, what the Mormons themselves call fundamentalists, what the Mormons themselves call apostates. And Ron and Dan had gone uber Mormon and become fundamentalist prophets themselves. They were invited out of the Mormon church as their beliefs got more and more radical, talking about not wanting to pay taxes and being a law unto themselves and so forth and so on. And you all can read all the information you want on Ron and Dan Lafferty. But the news reports were specifically about how Ron and Dan Lafferty had decided that Dan was the second coming of Jesus Christ, or the next prophet, and that they had been working on bringing their family into this new religion. And the news report detailed how the youngest brother, Alan, I don't know if he's the youngest brother, but the younger brother, Alan, was resisting joining Dan and Ron in their new fundamentalist religion. Not even a new religion. They were just extreme Mormons. But, of course, the Mormon Church had disavowed them by then. So, eventually it came out that Alan was... one of the major reasons why Alan was resisting joining the Ron and Dan Lafferty show was the faithfulness of his wife, Brenda. And of course, the news reports eventually talked about the fact that Dan and Ron murdered Brenda because she was standing in the way of Alan joining their little party. In other words, she was causing Alan to dwindle in disbelief, or unbelief, sorry. She was causing Alan to dwindle in unbelief. And then I remember the day I realized, when they first announced her full name, Brenda Wright Lafferty. And I realized that Dan Lafferty and Ron Lafferty, in the spirit of Nephi, had murdered Brenda Wright Lafferty and her 18-month-old baby daughter, because God told them to, because God told them that she could cause a nation to dwell in unbelief. If you want to look at a nation as the posterity of Alan Lafferty. I must admit it was particularly creepy when the news stations all started airing her obituary, and they talked a lot about her involvement in the BYU television production school, and that she was an anchor on weeknight, that little news program I told you about. As an aside here, I want to mention that the portrayal in the HBO series, or was it Netflix, called Under the Banner of Heaven, which purports that Brenda was solicited and or sexually assaulted by one of the professors at the BYU production studios. That's a bunch of bull crap. That didn't happen. That would never have happened. Just an aside for you, as someone who was there. But yeah, I was really creeped out to have it, to be reminded that I worked with her, I dated her, and that hit me pretty hard. that hit me real hard, to realize that some of the very tenets that I was taught over and over and over again as a young man were the foundation of these crazy men's murderous rampage, and that they had murdered someone that I knew. So, skipping ahead a little bit, because I'm not going to do this totally in chronological order, but as I mentioned, I went to BYU for college, and of course met a gal there that in the late summer of 1979 I married, had children with. By the time 1994 came along, we realized that the marriage was not going to work out. I couldn't be the ultra Mormon that she wanted, and she was an absolute control freak, and I couldn't keep the marriage going. So we divorced in 1994. We actually divorced earlier in 1993, and after 3 or 4 weeks we remarried. But we realized that by 1994 it was over, and we decided to go our separate ways. I moved out, and I still would go over to the home that I built in Riverton to do upkeep on the house, mow the lawn, fix the sprinklers, so forth and so on. But my wife of the time was a very, very strict, ultra Mormon. And the dichotomy of having a happy, perfect Mormon marriage and our failing marriage just set up a dissonance in her that, put it frankly, it led to mental illness. She started having visions and revelations. She was going to the doctor to have pregnancy tests week after week after week when she didn't have a partner. She was telling people that the president of the Mormon Church was going to marry her, when it was pointed out to her that the president of the Mormon Church, Thomas S. Monson's wife, would probably have some things to say about that. She had a revelation that that woman was going to die very soon, and that she would be taking her place. She had revelations, multiple occasions, about she was going to bear the last child to be born on earth. Of course, that was the, I guess, the reason for all the pregnancy tests. Long story short, she had fallen into the mental illness condition that a lot of ultra Mormons do, that, hey, we're going to get all kinds of answers and they're going to come as revelation from God. Well, as I mentioned, I then was always going over to the house to maintain it. And one day when I went over to mow the lawn, I got about halfway through the job and I needed to use the restroom. So, being as it was a friendly divorce, at least at the time, I went up to the master bath and had my business done. And as I came back out from the bathroom, I saw that my wife's journal was laid out open on the bed, and it hadn't been there when I went into the bathroom. So thinking that it was some paperwork she wanted me to look at regarding the divorce, I went over and looked at the page that it was open to, and oh my goodness, I was shocked. I was just terrified, really, and let me show you what that was. I'm going to let you see it and let you draw your own conclusions first. Basically, it says, if Steve must die, let it be painless, in his sleep. Father, forgive him, for he knows not what he does. Not my will, but thy will be done. I want Steve to survive. And if you don't think, particularly after my experience with having one of my friends killed by their own close relatives in the name of God, if you don't think that freaked me out beyond all ability to comprehend, as my dad likes to say, you got another thing coming. She was having visions and revelations of her own, as Mormons believe they are privy to do. Now, most reasonable Mormons believe that they have this power, this gift of revelation on a very, very personal, very private, very this is just about me type level. But a lot of Mormons take that further and begin to have visions and revelations on the behalf of other people. It's so very, very common for Mormons, for a Mormon missionary to go up to a woman and say, God has revealed to me that I'm to marry you, without any consideration whatsoever about what the poor woman thinks herself. And vice versa actually happens as well. So I'm not going to be sexist one way or the other on that. But when a Mormon starts to believe that he or she is receiving revelation that is intended to guide someone else's life, you're entering the danger zone. You're entering wacko land, and my wife was there fully. So for someone who had only recently, a few years earlier, experienced a religious inspired murder of someone I knew, to have my own wife writing down revelations that I was to die really scared the bejesus out of me. And I'm not going to lie. That's a really personal thing. It's something that I've kept to myself for many, many years, except to speak specifically to my kids about it. So there it is, in black and white. Another situation where I believe a young girl who grew up to become my wife was exposed at a very, very early age to Nephi's righteous murder direction, that he was told to murder someone in his righteousness. And I just want to make it understood that it is this underlying feeling that if God tells you to harm someone, and you know you're the righteous one, as my wife was positive of, then it's okay to do it. And that is just very, very scary to me. Okay, now we're going to talk about probably one of the most high-profile incidents that a lot of the other general public would have seen, but had a very, very strong effect on me, and that was in, I believe it was 1985, and the case of Mark Hofmann. I'm not going to go into all the details because, oh my heck, it's an extremely complicated story. But suffice it to say that Mark Hofmann grew up as a very, very, very faithful young Mormon boy. His parents were very strict in the church. And of course, he was constantly exposed to the story of Nephi in the Book of Mormon. As he got older, as he became a young man, father, so forth and so on, he basically fell away from the Mormon church. He had not been invited out, as most people are, but he had become a doubting member, if you will, a nuanced member, if you will. And his life's passions had been creating forgeries that would fool his friends and family. So the background, of course, is that he started forging all kinds of supposed Mormon historical documents. And one of those projects that he was involved in was he was claiming to have located the McClellan collection. Well, what's the McClellan collection? Well, it's, to put it briefly, it is supposedly a collection of the writings and or speeches of William E. McClellan, who was a very, very early leader of the Mormon Church. He fell away from the Mormon Church. He got sideways with Joseph Smith, and I guess basically spent the rest of his life collecting documents and so forth that would prove Joseph Smith a fraud. It's been rumored throughout the Mormon zeitgeist for hundreds of years that this collection of documents, termed the McClellan collection, existed out there somewhere, and Mark Hofmann had convinced people that he had located it. And so the church basically wanted to secure that collection from him, but they didn't want to be seen as buying the collection directly from him, because earlier they had bought a forgery from him directly and got egg on their face because the forgery made it sound like or seemingly proved that early Mormons believed in folk magic and salamanders and spirits and pirates and Indians and giants and so forth and so on. So the Mormon Church decided, we're going to have one of our faithful members, actually a bishop named Stephen Christensen. We're going to have him buy that collection for us so that we can't be seen as purchasing it directly. In today's world, we call that money laundering, by the way. So Stephen Christensen had given Mark Hoffman a bunch of money as a down payment on this McClellan collection. And it was taking a long time for Mark Hoffman to create this forgery collection. And so the Mormon Church itself got very impatient with Hoffman and had Stephen Christensen pressure him to deliver the McClellan collection. In response to the pressure that Stephen Christensen was giving Mark Hoffman, was putting on Mark Hoffman, Hoffman, in his own twisted brain, decided, I need to do something big and fantastic to get them off my back. And as you'll read in all the news stories of the time, Mark Hoffman built a pipe bomb, not just any old pipe bomb. He stuffed it with cement nails, put it in a package, and put it on the doorstep, on the on the office doorstep of Stephen Christensen. And Stephen Christensen found it the next morning. It exploded. And trigger warning here, it shredded Stephen Christensen. The first investigators on the scene weren't even able to identify him. They had to identify him through forensics later on. As a matter that has stuck on in my craw for a long time, when I finally learned about it, and I'll explain that in a second, when I finally learned the details of this horrific act, the first thing one of the most important things I discovered was that the very next day after, or maybe it was that same day, I don't know, the leaders of the Mormon Church sat down with Mark Hoffman. They invited him to the church headquarters, and they sat across the table, specifically Gordon B. Hinckley, sat across the table from Mark Hoffman and negotiated with him to have a different representative of the Mormon Church purchase this non-existent, this fraudulent McClellan collection that they still didn't know didn't exist. No remorse that one of their bishops had just been horrifically murdered that morning by the guy they were sitting across the table from. No discernment. What the Mormon Church was concerned about that morning was, well, we don't have Stephen Christensen anymore, so we got to talk to Mark Hoffman about who else we can have buy this collection from him. And at that point, I'd had it. How did I get involved in the story so deeply? Years later, I was the jury foreman on a case in which Gary Sheets, whose wife was also murdered by Mark Hoffman at the same time, in the same manner, was suing the county of Salt Lake and the city of Salt Lake for some personal matters involved with his wife's death. And I was the foreman on that jury. And after, I was the perfect juror in that case, because I had, as most faithful Mormons did at that time, completely and totally ignored any news reports about the situation. You know, we were told, those of us who lived in Utah at the time, were told don't pay any attention to any of the information that's coming out on this because it's horrific and yada yada yada. And what the church was doing was they were trying to keep the faithful from knowing anything about the absolutely horrible things that they themselves were doing. And I did that, and so I was the perfect juror on the case. After the case is when I started to research what had really happened and found all of these deep details. Things like the Mormon Church was giving Stephen Christensen credit on his tithing obligation equal to whatever he spent on trying to get this McClellan collection from Mark Hoffman. And again, in today's world, we call that money laundering. But I learned these details, and specifically when I learned that Gordon B. Hinckley was sitting down with Mark Hoffman immediately after Mark had murdered two of the church's faithful members, one a bishop and one the wife of, I believe Gary Sheets was a church leader at the time. Without any discernment at all, I'd had enough. And that is when I effectively left the Mormon Church. So what does that have to do with the theme of my rant here today? And I alluded to it already. Mark Hoffman was raised as a faithful Mormon. And as he was being raised, as he was growing up, he was exposed time and time and time and time again to the story of Nephi killing Laban. Now, I don't think Mark Hoffman ever claimed that God told him to kill Steve Christensen. I don't think that God ever told Mark Hoffman that Kathy Sheets, who was an absolutely total innocent bystander here, needed to be killed to further up the kingdom of God. But Mark Hoffman was taught as a young man that when someone gets in your way, you kill them. Laban was doing nothing but getting in Nephi's way. Nephi wanted those records. He wanted those family treasures. And Laban was doing nothing more than getting in his way. And so young LDS boys and girls are taught that when someone gets in your way, maybe it's time to kill them. Maybe it's time to get them out of your way. The Lafferty brothers killed Brenda because she was in their way. I don't know why God told them to kill her 18-month-old baby, but they were taught that if someone is getting in your way and your goals are righteous, it's okay to kill them. It's okay to get them out of your way. So Mark Hoffman decided, I got to get Stephen Christensen out of my way. He keeps bugging me about delivering on this collection. Got to get rid of him. Mark Hoffman was a modern-day Nephi. I was in my wife's way. I was in the way of her righteousness. Can't tell you how many times in that journal she talked about how I was holding her back and how I was unworthy of her and the kids. And, you know, to be fair, the psychologists and the psychiatrists and everything that were called in on the case all told me that someone who is psychotic, and she was diagnosed as being clinically psychotic, they find answers, no matter how crazy the answers are. They find answers to handle the things that they're stressed about, that they're concerned about. And my wife knew I had a very large life insurance policy. And her answer was that God had decreed that I was to die. Didn't look like she had any revelations that she was supposed to do it, but I was in her way on the path of righteousness, and I needed to die so that my insurance policy would help her continue to handle her financial needs. So just remember, it's when you're in a Mormon's way that you're in danger. Period. Okay, now we can get to the crux of the matter and the reason that I chose to discuss this topic right now. It is a current criminal trial that is taking place in Idaho, Rexburg, Idaho, that is on everybody's minds, that's all over YouTube and all over the news, and that is the case of Lori Vallow Daybell. Chad Daybell, her newest husband, will be tried later on this year, but Lori Vallow Daybell is undergoing a criminal trial against her for the murder of her two children, J.J. Vallow, who was 7 years old, and Tylee Ryan, who was 17, almost 18. And for conspiracy to commit murder of Chad's first wife, Tammy Daybell. It's all over in the news, as I said, and it's all over Rexburg, Idaho. Actually, I think they're in another county. But Lori Vallow Daybell was a member of the Mormon Church living in Gilbert, Arizona, just about 5 miles over here from my house. And she's another one of those stories of someone who is just way over the line with ultra Mormon or uber Mormon. And when I say ultra, I mean beyond Mormonism. You can't blame the Mormons totally for where these people go with this kind of stuff. But she's on trial for murdering her two children, first of all. And when that trial finishes up, and we're going to talk about that specifically in a second, but when that trial finishes up, Lori will then be on trial in Arizona for the murder of her fourth husband, Charles Vallow. You guys can see all the news reports you want about all of that. That will explain what I'm talking about. But in a macabre coincidence, straight out of some of the weirdest fiction you'll ever try to come up with, Lori Vallow at the time literally announced that she could kill Charles Vallow because of the example set by Nephi in the Book of Mormon. She says that she's like Nephi and that she can kill Charles Vallow like Nephi did. And I'm not kidding. I am not joking. She literally says that Nephi in the Book of Mormon, killing Laban, is her example and her justification for being able to kill Charles if she feels like it. And why does she want to kill Charles Vallow? Why did she want to kill Charles Vallow? Because he was in her way. She was super righteous as far as she was concerned. And he wasn't as dedicated to the Mormon church as she was. Of course, the fact that she had started a adulterous affair with Chad Daybell by then, it seems lost on most people, but you and I know better. So again, she was a Mormon. She's since been invited out of the church. And she went beyond the teachings of the Mormon church. But she got her foundation from the teachings that she was subjected to as a young Mormon girl. And those teachings included Nephi killing Laban in the Book of Mormon. Boy, I mean, it sounds like I'm beating the same drum, but there it is. And then she herself tells everybody that that was her inspiration, that she can kill Charles Vallow if she wants to, like Nephi did. Then she went and killed her 2 little children because they were in her way. They were burdens for her new happy-go-lucky life with Chad Daybell. And of course, she was righteous, so she, as Nephi did, she was allowed to kill those children. I invite you to look deeply into this story. I invite you to look into Chad's super righteousness and how he decided that he was so much more righteous and intelligent and prophetic than regular, normal members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church. Because his prophecies and his speaking as a prophet and rating the children in their righteousness is what directly led to their deaths. He basically decided that both J.J. Vallow and Tylee Ryan were evil. He assigned them his lowest rating on his evilness scale. And of course, he was in the way of he and Lori just having hedonistic sex wherever they wanted to. And they, Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow Daybell, killed those 2 little children because they were in their way. In addition, Chad killed his first wife, Tammy Daybell, for which Lori Vallow Daybell is being charged with conspiracy to help commit that murder. She was in their way. They were religious, they were righteous, and Tammy Daybell was in their way. I've beat that horse enough. This is the way things go when you grow up in a religion that tells you as one of its first faith-promoting stories that this guy that was just about as egotistical as he could be, Mr. Righteous Nephi, had a right to kill Laban because Laban was standing in his way, because Laban was a bad guy, and because God told him that he could. When you grow up being read that story time and time again, when it's in your children's books that you read, when it is preached to you from the pulpit, when you sing songs about it as a child, when you hear your friends bear their testimony that they know that it was a righteous act, and when you go on a mission and teach people that the Book of Mormon is a true scripture from God, and yes, I know one of the first stories you're going to run across in that Book of Mormon is where Nephi killed Laban in cold-blooded murder. But God told him to do that, so just accept that and join our church. When you do that as a missionary, and you deny common sense, and you deny really what is appropriate in society, when you put aside your own morals for the morals that are spoon-fed to you by the church community that you grow up in, you've got the wrong idea. And when you decide you're a law unto yourself, when you decide that you're more righteous, when you decide that you're a judge and a jury, then you also become an executioner. And you find yourself believing that that's okay. It isn't okay. Stop teaching that story from the Book of Mormon. To all my Mormon friends and family, get that evil book out of your house. Stop teaching that bloodthirsty principle. Stop using it as an excuse for your own failings. Don't let another child be taught that it's okay to kill in the name of God. It's not. Stop it.